If you're from West Texas, have you heard of the legend of Betty White? Sadly, though, this isn't just another legend. This is actually a murder case that took place in West Texas. Our story begins when Betty Williams is born on August 11th, 1943. She was born into a very devout Baptist family, and she was actually the oldest child out of her siblings. And let's take a quick sec to go back and emphasize that she was born into a devout Baptist family. So that basically means no dating, no sex, no sleepovers, none of that good stuff. However, Betty did not 100% agree with her religion, and she was well ahead of her time. She would wear shirts without bras, she would go on dates openly, and she would sleep with boys, which is like a really big thing back in the 50s. Sex was still very taboo, especially if it was, not something serious. She was very free-minded, and she did not care about whose feelings she was gonna hurt in the process. Mac Herring was born September 23rd, 1943, and his dad was a World War II vet. There's not much information on his upbringing other than he was a football player at OHS and he hunted regularly with his dad. He did live middle class, whereas Betty's family was basically staying afloat because they had actually just made a very big transition. They had moved from another state to Odessa. In the summer of 1960, they started their little fling. They would be what is now known as a sneaky link because he would never take her around any of his friends. She never got his Leatherman, and he never ever presented her to his parents. So Betty sees that Mac isn't taking her serious, so she's like, you know what, I'm gonna sleep with his best friend. Word gets back to Mac, and he addresses his friend, and he's like, yo, did you sleep with Betty? They settle it out, and you know what they say? Bread before a hoe. They resume with their friendship. They're just like, it's just another girl, like, we're not gonna let her split up our friendship. Mac cuts off Betty, and he starts dating this redhead by the name of Amike. Keep in mind that the story does take place in high school. Betty is a senior at this point, and her only escape is acting. She is a bit dramatic, which if you do read the book, you can see that she actually gets that from her dad. Her dad is very emotionally manipulative. Always say that he was going to kill himself, and God is punishing the family because she would sin. And I'm not saying like sin like, she's going out and doing the nasties. It's just came home late, so God punished them by taking away their car. He was so emotionally manipulative towards the whole family. The drama teacher is not in any way impressed by Betty's acting, and she doesn't cast her in any roles her senior year, and she actually just has her as a stage manager, which breaks Betty even more on top of her breakup. And to make matters worse, Mac is actually given the lead role in the play where he is a, ironically, remorseless killer. Yeah. She starts to begin feeling hopeless because she lost her boyfriend she's not going to be casting, and guess what? Her dad found her diary, so that means that he found every bit of information about her, who she had been with, how many times, all her experiences. So, it just wasn't looking very good for Betty. By winter, things had actually gotten worse for Betty. It's noted that she took 4 aspirins because she was trying to commit suicide, and she would also tell her classmates in theater that she climbed up the rafters, but she couldn't build the courage to jump off. And 1 week before the premiere of the play, she was talking to Mike, and she said, "It's been nice knowing you." And he's like, "What do you mean?" And she tells him, "I finally convinced Mac into killing me." And then he said, "Okay, I'll send you roses." But nobody ever took it serious because, it's high school. People always are like, "Oh, I want to die." Everybody's dramatic in high school. So nobody took it serious. Nobody. Everybody saw it as an act. So the next day, Ike Nail drops off Betty. Ike is actually a popular junior, and Betty hints for him, to come back so they can shimmy. And she tells him to come back 30 minutes later. So he comes back around in the alley, and keep in mind that Betty's door has a back door to where she can walk to the backyard into the alley. So at 10:30, Betty exits her room and she goes into Ike's car where, they kind of start to make out, and then they see headlights pulling in. And who is it? None other than freaking Mike Herring. Yes. And she literally says, I didn't think he would come. And I could still kind of like, hey, like, what's going on? Like, we were just making out, where are you going? And she said, I've got to call his bluff even if it kills me. And he's still like thrown off, like, what is this girl talking about? So Betty hops out of the car and she's just like, bye Ike, like, I'm going with my mans. This is who I really want to be with. So the next day, Odessa Police Department receives a phone call from Mary Williams stating that her daughter is missing and nowhere to be found. All of the students start going to the principal's office to be interrogated. Ike told the investigators about his last encounter and finally that she actually ended up leaving with Mike. So the first time that he's actually interrogated, he says that he did pick her up, but he dropped her off at 12 a.m. where she went in through the front door. But that raises very high suspicions in him because first of all, he said that he didn't even check to see if she went inside. And second of all, if she would have gone in through the front door, she would have been caught by her parents. The police are not at all happy with his response, so they actually tell him to go to the station to go down for further questioning. It took 45 minutes, and finally Mac Herring cracked, and he started crying and explaining to investigators that Betty had actually begged for him to kill her, and she had actually chosen the 12-gauge shotgun. Mac tells them that he can take them to where the body is, and he takes them on a 26-mile drive to his father's hunting lease, and he takes them to a stock pond. This part does get a little bit graphic, so you can forward to the end. They get out of the police car and the cops ask him, where's her body? So he takes them to the pond where they start to see their footsteps, and then leading into the stock pond they actually see the blood splatter, and the cops are like, okay, so where's Betty? This dude starts to strip down. He takes off all his clothes and he starts wading into the water. Police can see that he's struggling to take something out after he comes out from being underneath the water, and they immediately see Betty's body being dragged out of the water, where police find that she is partially decapitated. She was wearing the pink pajamas that Ike had actually described to the police, and she had 2 bricks tied around her waist. So Mac tells the cops about how eager Betty was to reach heaven, and he actually, right before killing her, he asks her for a kiss to remember her by, where, she's like, yeah, like, I'll kiss you. And he said that she put the barrel of the gun on her forehead, where she proceeded to say, now. And that is when he pulled the trigger and he unalived her. But the thing is, as word got around town, people were actually understanding, and they made it seem like Betty was this horrible girl who made him kill her. And girls started finding out that their boyfriends had actually had intimate relationships with Betty, all the while, they were in the relationships, so of course they're like, oh no, she deserved to get killed. So Betty was the bad guy in a lot of people's eyes. Mac soon enough gets his own little posse called Mac's Girls, which are the girls that are for this dude killing Betty, and they justify it because he was pushed to the limit by Betty. February 20, 1962, he has his first trial, and guess what his attorney tries to pull? That Mac was insane at the time of the murder. That he was pushed to the brim by Betty. He was tested by a psychiatrist 3 days after the murder, and it was found by the jury that he was temporarily insane the day of the murder. So another trial was held because it was felt that the jurors were actually biased in their final decision. So they held another court 600 miles from Odessa in Baymont, where he was again found innocent by a verdict of insanity. Can you believe that? This dude went off to live a normal life. He was actually introduced in school as the kiss and kill murderer, like it was something very glamorized. He was remarried multiple times until ultimately he passed away a couple years ago, where he was once again put in the paper as kiss and kill murderer passes away of natural causes.